Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast. The P.A.S. Report provides an honest analysis on the critical issues that matter to you without the biased media filters. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
And welcome back to America. So we've got a lot to talk about yet on this program about what's happening in America with regard to schools and education. How about border security as well? Joining me now to talk about all of this and how it impacts what's happening in our educational system is Nick Giordano. He is a professor of political science. He's the host of the P.A.S. Report podcast and a fellow at Campus Reform's Higher Education Fellowship. Now, the professor has 2 decades of teaching experience and over a decade of experience in the emergency management, homeland security arena. So you can see where I'm about to go with this. Professor Giordano is regularly called on to speak about issues related to government, politics, and international relations. Professor, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you. And look, we've got an important topic to talk about with regard to the security of our homeland. And that is what's happening along the border, the southern border, and one could arguably say the northern border as well, but most notably what's happening along the southern border. How does that impact education for Americans living along the border?
Well, there's a lot of dimensions to this, and it doesn't just impact along our border, it's impacting the totality of the United States. A lot of the focus when it comes to illegal immigration and migration into the United States has been on what's going on in the city areas as far as hotels and, food and all sorts of things being provided. But nobody's really focusing on the 400,000 unaccompanied minors that have been brought into the United States and the couple million other children that have been brought in under family units into the United States. We are a country, we're a humane country. And if children come to the United States, whether they're legal or illegal, we want them in school getting an education. And so the numbers that we're talking about are astounding. In New York City, for instance, over 30,000 of these children enrolled in the New York City public education system. And when you have that many students enrolling in such a short period of time, there is little doubt it's going to impact the quality of education that all students are receiving. And this is an education system that's already failing. So now it's going to get far worse. It's also extremely expensive. It costs in New York City about $38,000 per year per student to provide an education. So we're talking hundreds of millions to billions of dollars here. If we look at Denver, Colorado, we know for weeks they've been seeing enrollments, 300 students enrolling per week. And it's overwhelming the system. But the biggest national security threat that exists is the fact, what type of education are these students receiving? And I think that's where this story is. We've seen this anti-American push in our education system where students are being taught that America is inherently evil, we're an inherently racist country, that they are going to be oppressed and they're victims. And what type of toxic messaging does that send? I mean, these are people that travel thousands of miles. They now enroll in a school system only to be told that the country they came to is this horrible place where they're going to be victims, they're going to be oppressed. And so down the road, how are these students ever going to get a sense of loyalty towards the United States? And are these students going to grow up being very bitter and resentful to the country they came to? And a lot of people aren't focusing on that.
I'm glad you're focusing on it. I'm glad you're bringing it up for us to have a discussion on this. What you're talking about is really something that many Americans should be concerned about, particularly those in the Oval Office, those within the administration, and of course those serving in the halls of Congress, and even our state and local legislators. We've seen how they've constantly kicked the can down the road when it comes to comprehensive immigration reform. So what can we, the American people, do if our members of Congress are not doing the right thing to address what's happening to the children coming across the border and impacting the lives of our own children. As you said rightly, Professor Giordano, the fact that we are a compassionate nation. If we see a child come across the border, we want to help that child. So what do we, the people, need to do to actually help improve the educational quality for all children?
And that's the difficult part, right? Because we have the political officials that have been voted into office, the elected officials, but then we also have the bureaucracy, people that work for the departments of education within the state and at the federal apparatus. And just to give the audience an understanding of what students are being taught, the New York State Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion framework, in their document, it states that, Black and brown people being targeted by police, and that inherent racism and systemic racism exist in all aspects of life, whether they're in the education system, healthcare. So that's the brainwashing that's going on, to put it in perspective. And when it comes to parents, we have an expectation that our children are going to be educated in a proper way, that they're going to reach certain levels of proficiency, that they're going to be able to become functioning citizens within our society, that they're going to get a civic education. And that's not happening already. Now it's getting much worse. We've reported at Campus Reform how colleges throughout the country, going back a decade, started to say that the melting pot was a racist concept, that it's a microaggression, because what the melting pot does in the United States, it teaches students that when you come here to this country, you assimilate into American culture. You shed some of the culture that you come from, and you adopt the American political values, liberty, freedom, the idea of democratic principles, limited government, and you become Americanized within that system. What makes the United States an exceptional place is the fact that the assimilation process has worked for over 2 centuries. However, the left has changed it. Now we have a system in place where it's America that has to adapt to the cultures that are coming here. And no longer are we seeing students assimilating into the system. And that's creating these micronations within our country. And that's where the problem lies, right? Because if they're looking at the United States with bitterness and resentment, and at the same time, we're not providing a deep understanding of American government, well, that's where you have explosive dynamics, because who is defending the United States out there? So there are roles that parents could play, because they can demand curriculums that are being taught to their children. They could also give their children a civic education. Parents have long taken a hands-off approach when it comes to education. If you went to a school board meeting a decade ago, you may get like 5 parents there. That would be a lot. Today, the school board meetings are actually packed with parents, because parents have seen that they had good faith that the education system was operating in the students' best interest and in the country's best interest, but they no longer think that. And so parents are much more actively involved, which is a good thing. However, we cannot change the dynamics if parents don't get engaged at the state level and start putting pressure on all the legislative bodies on the state level as well as the federal level, but also on the state boards of education that have dumbed down standards to a degree where our students are no longer meeting basic proficiency. Our students are having challenge. They can't write. They have difficulty reading. They can't do mathematics. The numbers are dire. We spend about over $1 trillion in education through every year, if we combine all the states in the federal apparatus. Our proficiency levels hover around 23% of students demonstrate proficiency. That means that you have 77% of students that don't meet the basic proficiency levels. And that's a disaster, because as we see in the decline in education that's been going on over the last decade, well, look at our nation. It's also been declining at the same time. And so there's a direct correlation that does matter, that we do have to focus on. Unfortunately, what's going on is you've had political officials and officials that have been appointed into these positions. They've forgotten what public service means. They've forgotten that they exist to serve the public, and that the American people and legal permanent residents come before anyone else. Instead, they now view it as public service means to rule over, and they believe that we exist to serve them. So that's the biggest problem that we're facing there.
And that was my point with the question. What happened to we the people, by the people, and for the people? That catch-all phrase that we seem to have forgotten in the circles of politics. And so, to your point, though, when parents are empowered and parents are engaged, they can show that collectively they can change the system for their children and even their children's children. So in getting parents to be more proactive, the fight seems to be, Professor Giordano, a fight between the parent and the teachers, or the parent and the Department of Education.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say parents and teachers, because there are a lot of teachers that are fed up. They don't want to be teaching the curriculums that are being
good point.
put out
I
there
stand
by the state
corrected.
apparatus.
And in full disclosure, my wife's a teacher and my daughter-in-law is a teacher, so I stand corrected.
Yeah, well, it's one of those things where, you know, you have teachers union boss Randy Weingarten that makes it as if she speaks for all teachers, and she doesn't. You know, a big part of the problem is that the American people have disengaged from the political process. And we're very good at complaining about things, but we're very bad at actually getting involved. And to give you an example, if we look at the New York City local elections in 2023, there was only a 7% voter turnout. 7%. Now, I don't think you could go into the city and find a single person that says everything's perfect in the city and there's no issues.
Right.
So why are so many people not getting engaged at the local and state level? Part of it is because of this failed education system. As we stop teaching about American government, our founding, and the concept of federalism that the founding fathers felt was really important. That's why they built out the Constitution after the Articles of Confederation collapsed. Well, people today tend to nationalize every single issue, and they don't realize how much power they have at the local and state level, and they don't get involved at the local and state level. So parents need to re-educate, reintroduce themselves to American government and understand why the founding fathers built the system out the way they did. And that's the steps that we need to take to start taking back the education system. No other country in the world would allow their students to go through an education system that promotes anti-Americanism, that promotes anti-Western civilization, because a country can't survive. Our country will not survive if those are the things that we were promoting.
Yeah.
We have to promote things like American exceptionalism. We have to teach the totality of American history, both the good and the bad. We have to focus on the concept of citizenship and what civic obligation means. I mean, I ask my students all the time, we constantly say the government has a responsibility and duty to do X, Y, and Z, but what's our obligation to the system? And most of them may say vote, because that's the easy one. They may say pay taxes, because that's the easy one. But we're not even doing the voting correctly. And there's many more ways to actually get involved. So it's actually stunning when you see the mindset of the student body today coming into my class, where not a single one of them could actually pass the citizenship exam. I give that the first day of every class, every semester, and I'll only get a handful out of 200 students passing the citizenship exam.
Wow.
The students don't know basic facts of our country, and it's time that we begin to turn that around.
Yeah, and some of those students are saying, or complaining about the country, saying they want to leave it, and they don't understand what a dictatorship looks like or communism looks like, and they don't understand what democracy and freedom looks like, sadly, and that means we've got a lot of work to do. I want to take a break. When I come back from the break, I'd like to talk to you about the cultural divide and the political divide that has seeped into the very fabric of the education of our children. Back with more of Professor Nicholas Giordano after this. Welcome back to America's Hope. We're talking about education with, or I should say even education reform, with Nicholas Giordano. He's a professor of political science, and he's done so much to help people understand through campus reform how we do need to have reform of how we view the border security issue, how that impacts our education. A lot of children coming across the border. What do we do with the children when they go to school, to already overcrowded schools in some of our cities, like New York City, for example? we have an obligation, and that's to teach them and to teach them well. But education is being challenged in America, and one of those challenges, Professor, is the cultural war that we see going on our college campuses as well as our high schools. Earlier on this program, we spoke with a young lady who'd identified herself as being a biological woman at the University of Cincinnati, and she received a failing grade for that, and she's a chemistry major, and now she finds herself in the middle of a culture war trying to elevate the awareness of all Americans that a woman is a woman, and she should be able to define herself as being a woman and not being threatened by that. Cultural wars, how have they seeped into our lexicon of higher education?
Well, there was many that actually believed that the culture wars were won in the early 2000s, and they were surely mistaken, as we're witnessing today. And we see it at Campus Reform every day because we field complaints from the student body, and people send us tips all the time to the students. And we've reported extensively on this idea of diversity, equity, inclusion, that it's an idea that's based on division, based on dividing people, lumping them into groups, and then those groups are all pitted against each other. Now, again, all we have to do is look to our founding fathers, because George Washington warned why assimilation is so important within our society, particularly America, because there's very little that's going to link us together like other nation states in the world. Other nation states have thousands of years of recorded history. They have a shared culture. They have shared traditions. We don't have that. We are a bunch of different people from different places that have come together and actually made the country work. That's very rare. Our national motto is e pluribus unum. Out of many, one. Out of many different peoples comes one nation. And so when we examine that, there's a lot of focus on this idea of division in society. And Teddy Roosevelt warned about our country turning into a nation of squabbling nationalities. But the division isn't the difficult part. The division isn't the problem. In a free society, when it comes to political issues, you're going to have division. If you want unity, go to North Korea, go to communist China. They have unity. You have to toe the government line at all costs, and that's it. In our society, we appreciate the differences. We appreciate the division within political issues. What we've forgotten is what actually unifies us, though, what brings us together, and that's the foundational principles of the United States. Now, our education system was created, you go back to Horace Mann back in the 1830s or 40s, where he wanted an education system that, yes, you'll get the 3 R's, but more importantly, you're going to learn discipline and a civic education and understand the concept of this nation state we call the United States. We've deviated far from that. We've taken our focus away from that. And that's the problem. Most people don't know what links us together anymore. That's where the danger lies. And then if we bring it back to the border situation, you now have hundreds of thousands of children to over 1 million children crossing over the border that don't have any real ties to this nation, that are not going to get the foundational principles of the United States. And so we need to revamp the entire education system, because at Campus Reform, we're warning, it's no longer about education. When you have states like Oregon that is dropping proficiency standards when it comes to reading, writing, and mathematics in order to get your high school diploma, it's not about education. When you have states like New York that performs twice below the national average when it comes to proficiency levels, and then they actually simply redefine proficiency. They lower the standard to reflect what they deem as the new normal coming out of COVID. That's a problem. We need to demand more and demand better. Yeah. And any education official that comes out there and says that this is the new normal, or that we need to lower standards to help these students succeed, that person should not be in education at all. I have white students, I have Spanish students, Black students, and Asian students. And every student, regardless of their attribute, is capable of performing in my classroom. There's no difference between the different races, the different cultures that exist. They are all capable. And unfortunately, we live in a society today where we have people pushing this idea that there's uncompetitiveness. And since there's a group of people that may not be able to perform, we got to change the system in order to make equitable outcomes, to make sure that everyone has the same outcome. And that's to the detriment of our society. We have done away with the concept of merit. You see honors programs being thrown out across the country based on this idea of equity. We're no longer producing the best and the brightest. And we constantly say that these are the future leaders of our country. Well, if these are the future leaders of our country, we're in trouble. We either need to treat them as the future leaders and give them a solid basis, a solid education, or we're going to be doomed.
I appreciate you coming on and sharing your insights. So good to have you on, Professor Nicholas Giordano. Don't make this your last time. Before I let you go, my final question is, what is your hope for America?
I think people are waking up. I do think when I look at the reactions and I speak to parents are always reaching out to me. I speak to other teachers out there. A lot of people are sick and tired of what's going on. They just need to find their voices to speak up. And I think that's the most important thing. There was a lot of fear out there that if you speak up, you're going to get in trouble, you'll be canceled, you'll be ostracized and criticized. But I think people have finally hit the point where when you're attacking kids, when you're destroying their education, they're willing to stand up for their children. So I am hopeful and optimistic as more people are getting involved and more people are waking up to the realities of what's happening within the education system.
Thank you for coming on. Appreciate you. Professor Nicholas Giordano.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast.
Have a good one. Bye.
Be sure to rate, share, and subscribe to the podcast so you'll never miss an episode. Also, visit PASreport.com and follow us on Twitter at PAS Report.